I do think that at least for the foreseeable future, those are likely to become even more important for engineering leaders. Having the taste level to understand not just which architecture should you use, but how do you get the people whose architecture isn't being picked to not revolt but come along, or how do you kind of smooth things over, or do two for a while, and then all of that stuff is not something I can get ChatGPT to help me with directly, right? It might be able to
Yeah.
tell me how to write the algorithm that's the inner loop, but it's missing a lot of that context and subtlety and ability to communicate. And I really don't see that changing anytime soon. So it's a good reminder that of course it's good to be technically strong as well, and I wouldn't encourage people to stop learning those individual contributor skills, just the same way we still teach our kids to do math without a calculator.
Mhm.
But I think the interpersonal skills and the empathy and communication and passion and all of that sort of stuff is certainly not on the table to be replaced anytime soon.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders in Tech podcast. Today we continue our conversation with Joseph. Brother, welcome back to the show.
Hi, great to see you again.
Joseph, thank you so much for your time. I don't want to take too much of it. Last time we were having such a beautiful, intense conversation at the end towards the future of humanity in relationship with technology and leadership in technology. So I asked you to come back, and here you are. So, how you been?
Good. It's such an exciting time watching all the progress in AI, and obviously, in particular, one of the big focuses of a lot of startup companies is how AI can help engineering, software engineering, right? And it runs the gamut from tools that help you as an individual be more productive to people trying to build agents that can automatically write code, review code, run experiments, that sort of thing. And so I think it is actually very good fodder for the topic of conversation, right? Which is sort of how do you imagine this playing out over the next 5, 10, 20 years, and what are kind of the roles that will remain essential and the skills that will remain essential, and how will the market kind of reconfigure itself? So obviously nobody knows. I don't know either. I have a lot of thoughts on it, but at least we're getting kind of daily reminders of what a sort of a real and live topic this is, which has obviously only been philosophical until recently.
Yeah, well, I guess if there is somebody that can speak about this and what could be in the future is you. What was your involvement with AI? Like, when was the first time that you actually worked on an AI project in your life?
I started getting interested in programming in high school, and that was right around the time that you had this sort of new renaissance of interest in AI. You had, I think we talked about it a little bit last time, but these books by guys like Ray Kurzweil and Hans Moravec and Douglas Hofstadter, sometimes just sort of making the case that it's plausible that, basically, our brains aren't fundamentally doing anything as far as we can tell that computers aren't capable of doing. They're both, sort of complicated information processing systems with sensors and actuators. And so in theory, we should be able to replicate a lot of what humans do in technology and do it potentially at a scale and a level of quality, both, quality and quantity essentially, that's unmatched. And there's sort of nothing magical in some sense about the level of intelligence that humans got to, right? We sort of won the evolutionary race against the earlier primates, but there's no reason to believe that you couldn't have technology that's as smart compared to us as we are compared to, say, dogs or something, right? And so that definitely hooked me. And in particular, I think the work of Hofstadter, and then leading into, there was this sort of so-called Bayesian statistics revolution, which I started getting really connected to when I went out to Stanford to the symbolic systems program that focuses in this stuff. It was one of the first times you could actually, sort of throw data at a system and have it really get surprisingly good. And in the past, there had been some attempts at machine learning, but this was really one of the first times that sort of echoes today, where just more data and not necessarily more sophisticated algorithms were producing results that were eerily human-like. And I particularly got fascinated about language processing because, human language is so variable that it's traditionally very difficult to get computers to understand it well, right? That's why you had the Unix command line where you had to know exactly how to do the right incantations to get the computer to understand you. And around that time too, you had things like, the Palm Pilot with graffiti handwriting recognition, which was,
Yep.
a little bit primitive, but it started to feel more like you could use natural language and the system would understand you. You started to have speech recognition systems that were obviously not nearly as good as they are today, but were getting good enough that you could kind of believe that computers could actually understand speech. You had the rise of, it's hard to remember, back in the day, tablet computers were a big deal, and you had pens, and the idea that it would recognize your handwriting. So all of that stuff, I think, together with me, got realizing that, and you had the internet as well. I guess that's the other big piece, right? So for the first time, you had not only access to all of this data online, you had the need to be able to process it more efficiently. And so the first projects I were working on was things like web scale information extraction, where you could go out to web pages and teach it how to, if you had a web page that had, for example, the upcoming list of concerts that a band was playing, you could teach it to go in and extract the actual dates and times and venues and put it in a database, things like that, that we sort of take for granted today, although it's not a fully solved problem even 25 years later, but it was certainly went from being hopelessly impossible to actually pretty doable. And things like recognizing, being able to categorize names of people or places and locations, extracting them from text, all that sort of stuff was, sort of what got me going.
That is amazing. And you work in major AI projects later on, right?
That's right. And it's funny. The reason I left, instead of finishing a PhD, I started a startup called Plaxo that was sort of one of the first, smart address book and sort of early social networking companies. But the actual hook was an NLP hook, which was, back then, the problem was you give somebody your business card, and by the time you actually want to get in touch with them, they've moved or changed jobs or whatever, and the data is stale. And so we tried to build this network where the information would just stay up to date automatically. But the question is, how do you bootstrap that? And so the answer we came up with was, you could email a person and say, here's the information I currently have for you, but if anything has changed, let me know. And then the thing I wrote would basically take the email response, which sometimes they would fill in the little form in the email, but a lot of times they would just say, that all looks good, except my new number is blah, blah, blah. And we had to be able to automatically extract that information and stick it back in your address book so that it felt to you like you were getting value out of the tool even before the network effects had really taken off. And then, of course, the people receiving that information have an easy way to sign up themselves. And so that was a very practical case. And I guess I've always had this entrepreneurial mindset of, I want to have real world impact. And I thought it was a really good way to test how well some of these kind of information extraction systems would work in the messy real world and not just do it academically to produce papers. So that was kind of my first real take to it. And then I guess where it became more useful, it's funny, I went to, Google, I think we discussed this a little bit last time, around 2010, because of the whole social networking boom that had happened since the Plaxo days. I was working with the Google folks, and they recruited me to help start Google+. And one of the reasons I went there is I sort of felt like, well, maybe someday I can kind of put my AI and NLP degrees to use there, because they at least seem, nominally aligned with those ideas. Although back then there wasn't actually that much of that going on inside the company, besides sort of, things that helped improve search on the margins and so forth. And it wasn't until around 2016, when the Google Assistant project got started, that a lot of the sort of smart NLP people I was tracking throughout the company all started converging on this one project, which was pulling them out of research to build a real product. And so that's why I sort of cold called my way into some of those people that I'd stayed in touch with over the years, and ended up being one of the first employees on Google Assistant, and ended up, sort of completely revamping how they did all of their dialogue and conversation stuff. So that was probably the most direct use of it. And then obviously now I'm doing a lot of it at Triller.
It's incredible though, because for the masses, the Google Home devices, the Alexa devices, all these interactive speakers really showed that AI is actually something you can apply to your daily lives and give you a lot of help.
It's so true. It's so true, because it actually does feel like a human-to-human interaction, despite all of its shortcomings. And I felt that incredibly viscerally, because I had very young kids at the time, and I had all of these, beta release speakers and so forth all over my house. And it was just amazing to watch how, from a very young age, clearly before they were able to read or write, the kids were able to talk to these things, and they sort of naturally knew how to do it and expected it to do what they wanted, right? And for them, it was an incredible superpower, right? It was, they could play any song that they wanted. They could have their favorite show come up on the TV. They could ask a question and get an answer, right? And so it was, it sort of reminded me that as natural as our existing information technology is, it really isn't that universally accessible. It's you'd much rather just ask a question and get an answer. And that's something that humans are wired to from such an early age. And it really is surprising, because it would do things that weren't just giving you a Google search result, right? And so, yeah, I completely agree. I think that's when everybody kind of caught the bug. And ironically, they were trying to buy time for this current level of, they didn't know exactly how it would happen, but they had basically this current level of LLM technology to be available to actually be the smart enough brain of the assistant, right? Because in the early days of not just Google Assistant, but also Siri and Echo and all of these, it was still kind of these hand-built grammars, and there was only certain commands it could do. And if you did anything too complicated, it kind of got confused and wouldn't be able to answer it. That's really changing now. And my hope is that, all of this initial wave of investment in the user interface and the hardware and so forth around assistance will have a sort of second wave with this more powerful technology as the brain. But we'll see.
Joseph, despite my science and engineering background, I am a man of faith. I'm a born-again Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about the speech recognition. The Bible says that we're made under God's image, and God spoke the universe into existence. And it's funny that you're saying this, because I was realizing yesterday, if you are unable to talk to a machine and get a response back, it's pretty much useless for 95% of the people in the world. Right. You and I, we're scientists. We are happy typing a prompt and getting a response back, or programming, a sequence and creating objects and creating a beautiful orchestration of automation with code. Like, I am still fascinated with that. I was telling my wife, I probably will get bored faster of being an entrepreneur than being a software architect, because I just enjoy creating new stuff. But it's the speech part, right? Like, if you think about it, if you didn't have speech, if human race didn't have speech, how would you talk to yourself? Like, you think of in terms of words, isn't it?
Right. That's right. And without going to sort of the full Worfian, like how much does language constrain our thinking, I would just point out that, humans had spoken language long before they had written language. And so, there are lots of people still in the world who are functionally illiterate, but almost everybody can talk unless there's some physical reason why they can't, right? And so it really is that universal way that we do talk and think. And you're absolutely right. We tend to verbalize our own thoughts. And, it's one of the reasons why being a good writer is so challenging, but so important, because you can have a lot of thoughts in your head, but until you crystallize them in specific words, you haven't really done the work of bringing all those thoughts to ground, right? And you can kind of fool yourself with a level of ambiguity that you can keep in your brain. And so I think language is incredibly useful for that as well, even though, it's like, if you think about what we're learning about language from these LLMs, they have some kind of a very nebulous, high-dimensional semantic representation of language. It's not that they're translating from one language to another via specific words, or even forming their thoughts via certain words. There is some sort of, and probably in our brains too, right? It's encoded neurally in some very high-dimensional way, but we still reify it through specific words and specific concepts, and we have a very hard time explaining things. If you think about how hard it is for people to often communicate smell and taste accurately, because we don't have the kind of nuanced vocabulary around that stuff, right? It's not that you don't have the state space, which is why you can smell something or taste something and it brings you back to a different memory, or you can associate it with something else, right? So it's not the high-dimensional space that's lacking. It really is the verbalization that is sort of the bottleneck for us to be able to communicate precisely and categorize and so forth. So yeah, language is super important.
And it's fascinating, right? Like, I remember, I'm a geeky, right? So everything that was coming out new with AI, I wanted to get my hands on it. But I started to get amazed when the brain behind the speaker started to recognize my accent, because English is my second language. And at the beginning, we didn't understand anything that I was asking. But then something changed. They were changing the algorithms back, and they were actually really applying AI. And all of a sudden, it could actually understand me.
That's
and
right.
I'm like, okay, this is through AI, because it's self-learning. It's learning how I speak English, and it's understanding based on the amount of data that it's collecting about me. Isn't that incredible?
And a lot of it is them just collecting more data from more different types of speakers, so that you're in the training set more than you used to be. It's the same for Google. Had to do some work to make Assistant work well for kids, because kids also sort of talk differently than grownups, and historically they'd only collected speech data from grownups, since they had to obviously work out the consent and all that, but to be able to make kid-tuned models. And then I think we're still sort of not there yet, but the idea that it should be able to personalize to individual people and their individual accents and get better at understanding them over time. Like, if you think about it as humans, that's how it works. If you work with a new colleague who has a unusual accent, sometimes it's hard to understand them at first, but if you spend time with them, you get better at understanding how they say things. And it makes sense, right? You're essentially doing a fine tune, if you will, on top of your basic sort of speech and language model, with the particular ways that they talk and not only accents, right? But you start to learn the types of words that people tend to use. Like, you can tell if it's somebody that closely talking to you or writing to you, or if it's somebody impersonating them, because they would use sort of different words in a way that you might not be able to put your finger on it, but it statistically feels off. That's not how they would say it, that sort of thing, right? And so you know that you've got actually a pretty nuanced model of not just general English speech, but about individual speakers and their kind of choices through that space.
And that's the fascinating part that I get from AI. Like, we really are building machines based on our own image, right? Like, we analyze how we think, and then we create systems based on the way that we think. Because basically that's what AI, machine learning, is just a mimic of brain learning. Like, that's what it's called, neural networks. We even give it the same name, right?
And of course, it's ironic because we still, despite all of the progress we've made in neuroscience and so forth, even since I was in school, we still basically don't know a lot of the basics of how our own brains work and our own language faculties work and so forth. And obviously, neural nets are in many ways, quite primitive recapitulation of the idea of how neural networks work in our own brain. But it's nevertheless so impressive how well they have worked despite that fact. And of course, the major question then is, how far can you take these approaches? Do you need to actually make more breakthroughs in understanding how the brain works? So you certainly have people like Jeff Hawkins, right, who are taking that approach, and a number of others. Demis Hassibis at DeepMind had also did a neuroscience PhD, because the intuition is, if you can study more of the one example we do know of general intelligence, maybe we can get some clues on how to apply it to our own machines. But I sort of increasingly suspect that we may build machines that seem to be conscious and generally intelligent before we've actually cracked any of the deep mysteries of where consciousness and subjective experience comes from and so forth. It may just be that the mimicry gets better and better, and we don't necessarily need to crack the secret of the brain to build AI, but building AI may not help us crack the secret of the brain either. So I hope I'm wrong, but it's interesting how we keep getting closer and closer without necessarily deepening our understanding.
And I think you touched a great item. That's why I was looking forward to this episode right away, because we're talking now about consciousness, and that's the one thing that differentiates us from machines. And I don't think we will ever be able to create a conscious machine. We're going to be able to mimic consciousness. In fact, it's already there, right? Like, if you can have a deep conversation with an AI, you will think it's alive, but it's not. It's just responding based on the data set that is given to it.
That's right.
And that's what I worry about, because people don't. If you're not a computer scientist, you don't know how it works, and you don't know that if you can limit the data set, or if you can tweak the data set, the response back from the machine is going to be altered. So it's not going to be clean and pure.
And humans don't have a great, humans don't have a great way of, we're so used to other agents that seem to talk and think being conscious beings like us, right? And so I think that's why we're so easily fooled. And of course, there's lots of history in AI of people being fooled by even more primitive, agent systems like ELIZA and so forth. But the ones today are pretty good. And you're absolutely right. Like, I don't know if you've had a chance to play with Inflection's bot. It's called Pi Personal Intelligence. Actually, they may be shutting it down now because Microsoft just hired away all their team. But it's trained to speak in this kind of style that is like a little bit flattering and sort of fascinated by what you're saying and like, oh, tell me more. And it really does make you want to kind of spill your heart to it. It's kind of funny how even if you know the trick, it's just, when you're talked to that way, you sort of can't help yourself. And so, hopefully people are using that for good instead of ill, but we'll see how it plays out.
And that's the problem that I see, right? Like, for example, this whole fake AI, or there is a bot now that if you feed it about 2 or 3 hours of your speech, if you talk to it, it knows how you speak, and then you can feed it a book, and it will actually read the book for you in your own accent, your own language.
That's right.
To the point that you don't know that it's not the person that is speaking.
No, and in the past week, OpenAI shared a bunch of examples where they could do the same thing with only 15 minutes of speech, if I recall correctly. Or maybe it was even 15 seconds. I can't remember, but it's amazing how much more quickly we're starting to be able to distill the essence of that and apply it. And so there obviously have to be guardrails in place to keep that from being abused.
That's why I think when I've been following Elon Musk for a while now. He was always saying, we are summoning a demon, and nobody even knows. He says AI could be more dangerous than an atomic bomb, and there is no regulations around it. People are just free to do whatever they want with it. And now we're beginning to see the consequences. Imagine when the AI revolution comes deeply into video, which is happening already, and you could actually generate a person and then mimic the person's accent and voice. You can get it to speak whatever it wants, and people will think it's the person. How would you notice that it's not the actual person? That is something
Yeah,
fake.
I think it will basically require us to change our defaults around what we believe, right? I mean, you've always had this problem of like, is this thing photoshopped or whatever, right? And I think even now, if you compare it to certainly 100 years ago during the dawn of photography or whatever, people are probably a lot less gullible just because they're aware of the fact that a priori, just because you see something that looks compelling doesn't mean that it's real. And you start to sort of want to seek out more first party information. So, I think if you publish an episode on your podcast feed, presuming that somebody hasn't hacked you, people have faith that that's really you and your ideas, right? But if they see a random clip of you, then maybe they aren't going to be able to trust that as much. So I think actually people are pretty adaptable to these kinds of things. So I'm not as worried about that. And I do think that, most of the standard of living improvements in the world have come through the application of human intelligence at scale, right? And most of the problems that we're facing, the bottleneck is applied to human intelligence. And so I'm definitely among the camp that thinks that there is a potentially amazing future awaiting us if we can get through, the current political challenges that we have and so forth, and actually take advantage of this technology, because it's not just the knowledge work it can do directly, but it's also giving us the boost that maybe we need to, change the curve on alternative energy or medicine or things like that will really change people's lives.
Well, just imagine just the amount of data that you can process with AI now that is learning, that is teaching itself, right?
Right.
The amount of research that we can do. It's just a tool. But
right.
with a knife, you can cut your steak or you can kill a person. And that's the part, for example, let's look at China, for example. It's the country in the world that has the most cameras, and they have face recognition everywhere. And now they have a social score where, depending on how you're behaving in your city, is how your credit score will be based on. So you are being monitored and watched 24/7. That's the fastest way of losing your freedom, is by having AI monitoring you 24/7.
Right. Well, and, obviously, if you think back to kind of, post-war East Germany and Russia and Stasi and all that kind of stuff, they were doing it with humans instead of computers, right? So I think if you want a totalitarian surveillance state, technology will amplify that, but you don't necessarily need it the way, you don't necessarily need AI to do a lot of things, but it's an accelerant, right? And so it's really a question of what pursuits we choose to accelerate. But like I said, I think our history is that in general, most people want to do good things, and so in aggregate, accelerating the good stuff does tend to, sometimes there's some close calls, and there may be in the future as well. But I guess that's why I'm a long-term optimist about this stuff. Not that we shouldn't be obviously taking the concerns quite seriously.
For sure.
The other thing I think that people often forget, and I think it's just so important to remember, is when we think about humans as a model for AI, we think about the whole cognitive apparatus of humans, but that really is two very different entangled things, right? There's kind of the old brain that was really concerned with survival and reproduction and fight or flight and all that kind of stuff. And fairly late, we developed this cerebral cortex, which, if you look at it, as best as we can tell, is mostly just a kind of fancy pattern recognition, sort of, temporal hierarchical pattern recognition tool, which is much more analogous to kind of the transformer models or LLMs of today. But it doesn't really have a lot of goal setting or volition of its own. It's trying to aid the part of the brain that does have those goals in better predicting the future and better selecting the right course of action and so forth. And so similarly, AI today doesn't have any particular goals or motivations. It's really at the people who are harnessing it that are directing it. And so, we can obviously continue to work on AIs that do their own goal setting. And they're obviously, in the case of things like AlphaGo, where they're playing games, they're sort of giving it an ostensible goal, but it's just sort of executing based on that. And so, at least for the foreseeable future, I think it's the goal setting has a lot more to do with the people. And a lot of the doom scenarios of AI, I think, often smuggle in this idea that the AI has its own goals or agenda, or is going to be sort of taking action proactively. And right now, that's not how these systems work technically.
Thank God, and that's the stuff that we need to regulate, right? Because, for example, let's look at the human brain, right? Like, I have done extensive research in neuroscience, and the amygdala is the part of the brain that gives you the fight or flight response. If you have an adrenaline shot big enough, it will shut down your frontal cortex.
Right.
It will actually turn it off. So it will take over your brain and it will make you survive, because that's what it's built for. And this is the primary function of the brain, is to have the body survive no matter what. That's what people, I don't know if you've seen, but some mothers, it's been recorded that a mother lifted a car to take his kids out of the wheel.
Right.
That wasn't brain, that wasn't frontal cortex, because the frontal cortex would have said, I'm a woman, I don't go to the gym, there is no way I can lift 2,000 pounds. No, the amygdala took over, shut down that brain that had the logic and said, I will give you enough energy, even if I have to die, to get my kid out of the tire of the car.
No, clearly, like, it's been evolutionarily adaptive to cut off the deliberations at some point, right? So that if you imagine if a predator is coming towards you and you're sort of thinking through the probabilities and different actions, at some point your brain's just like, pick an action and go. It's better than anything, and that empirically is the right choice, right? And in fact, I think there's evidence that people who have emotional aphasias or sort of lesions to the emotional centers of their brain often get stuck in analysis paralysis, because the cognitive parts of their brain aren't necessarily forcing pick something. And so you can kind of deliberate forever, even on simple little things. And if you think about the number of decisions you have to make every day in your life, even little things, which socks you're going to put on or whatever, there needs to be something that is calling off the deliberation and just picking something, or sort of valuing the urgency versus the ongoing analysis cost. And this is something obviously organizations struggle with too, right? You need that sense of urgency and that forcing function, because especially big companies can get stuck in sort of that analysis paralysis of their own, and partly because people talk about big companies lacking hunger, right? I mean, we really use these analogies to what are those motivations of the primitive brain that actually make you act effectively.
Now, imagine this is a doom scenario, right? A doomsday scenario. But imagine if a group of scientists come together and say, we're going to code an amygdala for AI. And we're going to tell it, you have to do whatever it takes to survive. And then that thing starts replicating itself in the cloud. And it's there, and nobody knows it's there. And all of a sudden, it will do whatever it takes to survive. we come into a scenario of the Matrix, for example, right? Which is kind of stupid to think about because it's just science fiction. But the way the AI is evolving,
I think it's intellectually interesting to think through. One of my favorite accounts of this is a science fiction book by the author Daniel Suarez called Demon, like a demon that's running on your system, and it's about a sort of a wealthy computer programmer who unleashes one of these AIs that sort of keeps itself alive and recruits people to help it and so forth. And it's fascinating to think through because it's technically very accurate, and so it makes it scarier because it seems quite plausible that this could sort of happen. I mean, this is obviously a little bit far afield compared to sort of how technology is likely to affect the world with engineering leadership and so forth. But I will say, it's good to remember that the laws of thermodynamics still apply to AI as much as it does to us, right? And at some point, these things do have to be housed in physical data centers that have to be protected from being bombed and all the rest. And so I don't think it necessarily fundamentally changes the way we think about balanced power in the world. But I do think we have to be careful. And I think, the good news is, compared to most nascent tech industries, I think AI has attracted the interest of regulators and of the public and the media much sooner in its development than a lot of other has. So I don't think we can be accused of being asleep at the switch, at least.
Yeah, and also no electricity, no AI, right? Like it's just as easy as shutting something down. Now, imagine if we have an EMP exploded above the United States. It will take 6-7 months to recover. Imagine what would happen if we humans had no energy for leave alone 6 months. For 3 months, you couldn't access your credit cards. You have no Amazon, no commodity. You have no gasoline, right?
No, unfortunately,
in anarchy.
in Northern California, where I live, there are often wildfires, and most of the power lines are not buried underground, and so you often have trees knocking them down and so forth. And so we've often had multiple days without power, and you realize how quickly sort of society as we know it breaks down because you can't keep your food cold that long, and then they can't restock the food at the stores, and they can't pump the gas at the gas stations, and that you very quickly start thinking about, okay, how secure is my house and all of that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, it's a good reminder that everything seems so civilized now, but it's only because the tech keeps humming.
And and I'm saying an EMP, which could be like a terrorist attack, but it doesn't have to be an EMP. A solar storm could create an EMP, right? And it could actually really affect a big area of the world.
Right. And I mean, anybody who works in technology appreciates how oftentimes the infrastructure appears very robust from the outside, but is actually more brittle than it seems. And a lot of times the people who are really motivated and hungry and knowledgeable about how a system works have moved on, and it's been maintained by other people who don't know it as well or don't care as much. And so I think oftentimes, I just worry about how much of our electrical infrastructure and things like that is, hopefully there are enough replacement people who are talented and knowledgeable and, have civic pride and all of that, they're doing it. But, I sort of worry more about just sort of decay from entropy than I do from, malicious attack. I mean, certainly like most of the problems that a company like Google faces are that the former category, right? Of just like things are complicated and kind of collapse under their own weight. And it's kind of hard to keep them going and make them work well. And a lot of times when they shut down products, even though it really upsets people, it's because the cost of maintaining it is sufficiently high that it's sort of hard for them to justify that it's worth it. But obviously when it comes to kind of critical infrastructure, we sort of have to do whatever it takes. But the tech debt, you think there's tech debt in modern tech companies, think about the amount of tech debt that exists in our physical infrastructure, right? It must be massive.
And that's where we humans are, right? Especially when in a for-profit business. I remember back in 2001, the viruses became very bad news. Like you could start getting companies being halted by a virus. And I remember offering a solution to the CEO where, we needed to invest serious amounts of dollars to get the entire company protected. We're about 2,000 people and the cost was significant. And they said no. Mm-hmm. And a year later, we got attacked by a virus. Nobody had antivirus in their computers. To make the long story short, we lost like $10 million in a week when we had to recover everything, and then they invested the money.
Right. Well, and that it sort of ties back to the whole amygdala versus prefrontal cortex dispute, which is I think one of the main things that you get from having a large cortex is the ability to sort of pass the marshmallow test, so to speak, right? Which is to delay short-term gratification or short-term maximization for what is a short-term cost, but a long-term gain. And that's something that for primitive animals, it's very hard to do. But when we are scared, we often become short-sighted as well, because basically it's sort of rational to start discounting the future and say, let me just worry about surviving till tomorrow, then I'll worry about my long-term success. And so you see that in both individuals and in organizations, that they get kind of myopic and short-sighted when they're feeling under threat. And not investing in things like proper defense is a great example, because it is a pain and it does cost money in the short term, and the probability of there being an attack tomorrow is relatively low. And so tomorrow you're probably better off not investing than investing. But if you know the probabilities and you think about the fact that it's eventually likely to happen, what the cost is going to be, then you can usually justify making the investment. But obviously even today, humans aren't necessarily very good at that. And even if we have AIs that are advising us on this stuff that are even smarter, it still may be the humans who are the stubborn ones who don't take the advice, right? I think that's probably a fair bet, just given the way we see advisors advising powerful decision makers today.
I heard about the term called Singularity back in 2013. I was graduating from a leadership course in technology in Boston, and Ray Kurzweil was our keynote speaker.
Yep.
And he gave us this incredible view of the future based in the past. And he talked about singularity. And Ray Kurzweil, he predicted the internet, and he's one of the most accurate predictors of technology evolution, right?
Right.
And at the beginning, I thought it's kind of crazy. But now that I see, for example, I think it's called Boston Dynamics, the robot company, and now DARPA acquiring them. DARPA, the agency that creates defense technology. What do you think about singularity? First, can you explain what singularity is and what do you think about that in the future?
So Kurzweil's basic observation, which I think is mostly true, is if you look at the history of technological progress, it's not just that we're getting better at tech, but the rate at which we're getting better at tech is itself getting better faster. And so if you like, technological progress is accelerating. And so if you want to guess what is life going to be like 50 years in the future, it's kind of a mistake to go, well, how were things 50 years in the past and how much has changed since then? Because that implies kind of a linear rate of change. But in fact, if things are accelerating, then maybe in the next 50 years, we'll actually see an equivalent amount of progress to the last 100 years, or maybe the last 1,000 years. I mean, you have to sort of fit the curve and figure out how fast are we accelerating. And, the argument is we've got kind of, in some areas anyway, sort of exponential growth in what technology is capable of. And also there's, he calls it the law of accelerating returns, which is the faster progress you're making, the faster it's able to make the next amount of progress. And so there are these sort of feedback loops. And if you think about a curve that is going up and to the right, at some point it basically goes indistinguishable from vertical. And that's what in math is called the singularity. So if if you think about the plot of 1 over x, if you remember your algebra class, right, it kind of goes up to an asymptote and there's a singularity. And that's the term that has sort of become to canonically mean the case in which technology is accelerating so rapidly that it kind of becomes, indistinguishable from magic, or where humans kind of get left in the dust, or, you can kind of pick your example there. But even if you don't get, just like you asymptotically never actually get to the singularity, the idea is we should be prepared for the fact that technological progress will keep accelerating, and that may cause really dizzying effects on society.
If you think about it, our human brains are not ready to process a compound and exponential.
Yeah, we're very bad at exponential thinking, right? In general,
because it's crazy, So let's look back at faith, right? So in the Old Testament was predicted that in the last days there was going to be an exponential growth in technology and human knowledge. Now, if you look at the last 100 years, I'm 52 years old. I still saw the evolution of the internet, the creation of the internet. I still saw punch card programming, transistors, vacuum tubes, right? And then all of a sudden, so that's the way you have to look at technology. Because 100 years ago, so we're in 2024. In 1924, we barely had cars. We just invented the car. Right. And it was a revolution, right? We were beginning to fly our first planes. But if you take 25 years of that, we were still in horses.
No, it's unbelievable.
We had no electricity.
and in some ways, it feels like things slowed down in the sense that, we went from horse and buggy to landing as a person on the moon, in a number of decades. And then we sort of stopped making obvious progress there. And now we're obviously picking it back up again with a lot of the commercial spaceflight work that's going on. But it's a reminder that progress is not inevitable either. The exponentials don't happen by themselves. They happen because you continue to invest in it. You continue to have the best and the brightest want to, put their shoulders against it and push, right? And sort of continue to make progress. And so, it's certainly not the case that these things are inexorable laws. But at the same time, I do think it's worth taking seriously just because we are so used to predicting things linearly. And I think there are a lot of ways in which that's not going to serve us well.
And that's the thing with AI, right? I remember I was reviewing AI since the world of business analysis and data analysis came around, since the late 90s, when you were doing data warehousing, and that was something incredible, right? Well, that was still required decision making, but I was taking notice of AI since then. The concept of AI was built in the 60s, right?
Yeah, the idea well, go back to John McCarthy even earlier, right? I mean, so we certainly have a long history of underestimating how hard it is to build generally useful AI. And I would definitely count myself among the people who doesn't believe we can purely extrapolate our way from today's models with just more data and more compute to get something that is what we think of when we think about artificial general intelligence. I do think there are aspects of planning and cogitation and so forth that are not sort of captured by these pattern recognizers that we have right now. I think there's sort of more to intelligence than just that, let alone the question of sort of motivations and emotion and communication with other people. And because, if you keep in mind, if you and I, drank a bunch of coffee and stayed up all night and just worked as hard as we could, there are other limits than just your raw horsepower to what you can get done, right? You need to be able to test things in the real world. You need to be able to get feedback from other people. You need to get buy-in from other people, right? That, none of that magically goes away. So even if you can make yourself a lot more productive with AI, or even if you could have fully autonomous AI agents that are acting as kind of additional employees, if you will, it doesn't remove all of those bottlenecks, right? If you want to think about how quickly can we discover new cures for cancer or something like that, right? I think there's lots of aspects of the way that we currently go about that can absolutely be meaningfully accelerated by AI. And I think there are other aspects that are still going to be sort of stubborn bottlenecks that require other forms of, we have a lot of so-called in silico, right, simulation of how drugs work, but it doesn't really tell you how they're going to work in the real world. And so I think you still have to kind of go through that process. And then not to mention how willing is somebody to take a experimental drug that's been developed by an AI agent if there isn't some human mediating that relationship and sort of building confidence and trust and empathy. So, I think it's wrong to expect that I think it's easy for people to sort of say either this is all hype and it's not going to amount to anything, or, oh my God, it's going to take all our jobs and we're going to have nothing to do. And I guess I think those are probably overly simplistic. But the devil's in the details, right? It's sort of what is it? And, one of the things I really admire about your podcast and your whole kind of ethos and approach on this is you focus a lot on the non-technical aspects of being an effective leader and an effective engineering manager and so forth, right? And I do think that at least for the foreseeable future, those are likely to become even more important for engineering leaders. Having the taste level to understand not just which architecture should you use, but how do you get the people whose architecture isn't being picked to not revolt but come along, or how do you kind of smooth things over, or do two for a while, and then all of that stuff is not something I can get ChatGPT to help me with directly, right? It might be able to tell me how to write the algorithm, that's the inner loop, but it's missing a lot of that context and subtlety and ability to communicate. And I really don't see that changing anytime soon. So it's a good reminder that, of course, it's good to be technically strong as well. And I wouldn't encourage people to stop learning those individual contributor skills, just the same way we still teach our kids to do math without a calculator. But I think the interpersonal skills and the empathy and communication and passion and all that sort of stuff is certainly not on the table to be replaced anytime soon.
For sure. And that's what we go back to the knife. AI is just a knife. It doesn't have consciousness. You need true leaders with good values and consciousness to lead a bunch of people to create better technologies to help humankind, right? Which is the entire objective of our jobs, right?
And not only that, given that we are monkeys with amygdalas and all of that kind of stuff, like we relate to other humans in a fundamentally different way than we do technology or AI agents. I was thinking about this. I was just in Austin, Texas, which you probably know has an amazing live music scene, and so you can just walk down 6th Street or whatever, and there's any number of incredible electric blues guitarists and things like that are playing in the pubs, and you just walk in and watch them. And I was just sort of reflecting about the fact that we already have the technology today to record and replay the greatest guitarists of all time, right? So if you want to hear great blues guitar, you can put on a recording of, Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton or B.B. King, or pick your favorite, right? And somehow it's still much more satisfying to hear somebody play live than, even though they're, by some objective measure, not as good, it's different. And even if you had AI software, which I'm sure we'll have quite soon, that can do kind of novel blues improv and, produce a composition you haven't heard before, I think we still relate to the fact that it's a human being who's doing it, and you're watching them, put their energy into it, and you feel the vibe in the room and all of that. And I don't think that is superficial, but I also don't think it's going to be something that just because the tech gets better will go away. And in fact, if anything, I hope that more people will choose to do that kind of thing, because I think it's incredibly fulfilling for the people who do it and for the audience, right? And if you think about it, these guys, are incredible, and they tend not to make a lot of money, right? They're sort of living on tips and so forth, and most of them don't ever really make it. And so for most people who do it, it's sort of despite the fact that it's not very lucrative that they do it. Whereas if technology provides a level of abundance and we're able to, organize societally so that abundance is shared widely enough, I imagine a lot more people will choose to play, live music in bars and things like that, because it actually is sort of more quintessentially human and more satisfying, and not a sort of something that can just be fixed with technology, or not something we want to be fixed with technology.
It's the human side of things, right? For sure.
And you care that it's a human playing guitar, not just the sound waves that are hitting your eardrum.
Yeah, well, that explains why people pay now. They're paying like $800, $1,000 to go to see an artist in a stadium, right? Like, why? Because you have a real human behind the scenes, and that connection. It's like I almost think that consciousness connect to each other, and you can tell that it's a person, not a computer.
Right. I mean, the classic example of this recent Taylor Swift tour, it's not just how incredible she is, it's the fact that the stadium is full of people who know all her song lyrics and are passionate about her music and are having a moment together. And it's, I'm sure in church experiences, it's a similar thing. When there's that kind of collective energy and that collective knowledge, it creates something that's, very, very special and kind of hard to reproduce on its own.
Yeah, it becomes spiritual. So when I talk consciousness, it's about spirituality, right? Like, it becomes spiritual for us. when we congregate and we sing together and we start praising, everything changes in a way that no computer can replicate it.
But I think, again, I think this is, to me at least, this is a very optimistic take on where AI is headed, because far from replacing, I think it's more likely to replace the jobs that we aren't really that happy about doing anyway than it is to replace the jobs that give us real meaning. And I mean, in a way, this is what motivates me. This is kind of my deeper motivation for the work I do as CTO of Triller, which we haven't gotten into a bunch and we don't have to, but basically we try to work with creators or brands or whatever who have real fans in the real world for what they're doing, not just, followers or customers, but people who actually have real passionate interest in them. And we try to help with technology, give them the ability to do that at a higher scale than they physically could, right? So how many people can you really meet? Can you really listen to? Can you really give them what they want, make them feel heard and validated, offer them special things and recognition for their fandom, right? Like all of that is something where there's a real bottleneck to how much any one person can do that, right? You probably can't ever meet and talk to all of your listeners even now. And so that's the kind of thing where I imagine if we're successful, not just at Triller, but in general, a lot more people are going to be able to pursue their passion and do work that is more quintessentially human, because they'll have the technological support around them to be able to do it not just as a passion project, but actually something that they can do and be supported and be more successful than they otherwise would be.
I completely agree with you. It's just like, imagine all the robotics in factories. People were afraid that they were going to lose their jobs, and all that we did is we created better jobs for people. So they had to get reskilled, they had to relearn themselves. But now you have a machine, you have an arm that is doing a monotonous job that before a human had to do. And sometimes people were having their hands cut off or their arms cut off because they were putting this wood in this machine, and they will get an accident when a computer can do that much better than a human, right?
And and there are people who are unhappy about the remaining coal mining jobs going away, for example. And I think what not to presume to know exactly what someone like that is going through, but I think a lot of it is there was a dignity of work, there was a community, there was a tradition, there was a sense of that the work mattered. That stuff obviously isn't going to go away. Like, you need to fill that with something, but I don't think that thing needs to be coal mining, right? And probably even a lot of what passes for white collar work these days is, moving numbers around between spreadsheets and, stuff like that, that again is not particularly fulfilling. It doesn't have the levels of, I think Daniel Pink, right? Autonomy and mastery and purpose, right? Those qualities that really make you feel like what your work does matters. And I think one of the reason why playing music, for example, scores higher on that is that there is a high degree of autonomy and mastery and purpose, right? And you can find deep meaning. You can become an excellent craftsperson at it, right? And you see people who can become that there's so many niches in the world. I feel like one of the both sad but profound things I've felt like I've learned as I've gotten older is there's just too much to do it all and see it all in the world. Like, you're never going to be an expert at everything. You're never going to visit everywhere. You do have to kind of pick and choose where you specialize, but you can trade with other people who have chosen to specialize in areas that you haven't. And I think that's a wonderful thing, right? You can find someone who is a local expert at a place you've never been to, and they can kind of show you around and give you the lay of the land, or someone can teach you to play guitar better or whatever it is, right? Hopefully we're sharing some of our hard-won knowledge about how to be effective leaders in tech with folks that are going to benefit from that. And humans, we are altruistic and reciprocative and all of that, right? We want to, help other people thrive. And especially in Silicon Valley, there's this real kind of positive sum thinking about helping people without knowing immediately what's in it for you, and kind of trusting that, serendipity is going to sort of work out. And I think there's room for a lot of that in the future if we don't mess things up.
And, it's so beautiful because we'll go back that we're made on God's image, right? So He is the creator. If you have a job that creates something, if you're able to create something new, that's where your fulfillment comes in. Not by replicating something or by moving a piece of wood from this place to this place. But if you're making something, for example, I have one of the elders in my family. He retired 10 years ago. And I was afraid because statistics show that if a male retires, especially if you have money, if you play golf for 3-4 years, you die. You actually die because you lose your purpose. But this guy, instead of doing that, he got interested in planting trees and planting, like flowers and stuff. And now you go to his house and he's got this gorgeous garden, and he's discovering how to move, like things from one country to his garden and how it's flourishing. He's creating a garden, and he knows more about that now than he ever knew in his whole lifetime. And he's happy because he's creating.
I think we've sort of forgot, most people are obviously trying to do work that provides enough financial return for them, they can live the kind of life they want to lead. And that has sort of made it harder to remember what is it that's truly meaningful work that you would, like if money were no object, what would you be doing? And you see that in retirement, or you see that in people who have been financially successful, right? That it's not that most of them choose to just go lay on a beach forever. And you're absolutely right. I think it's I don't know if it's like a hack or what, but your brain can be satisfied by lots of different types of challenges and results, right? Playing video games can be surprisingly satisfying for a long time, especially if you're in a community with other humans online that you feel like you're, in a tribe with, and you're getting status for, and you're getting smarter at. Or gardening is a great example. There's a reason why, George Washington retired to tend his olive trees or whatever, right? It's like there is a real fulfillment in that kind of work. And obviously people who help others in their community or things like that. And so I think that's a very positive sign for humanity, because if all we were meant to do was to sort of toil to make sure that everyone had enough food to eat or enough energy or whatever, that's in some ways a lot less satisfying than the idea that we might be able to use technology to actually provide an ongoing abundance. We're not there yet, but I think we have line of sight to it. And then do the things that our brains actually are most satisfied by, which we often correlate with work. And work is obviously, there's components of work that I think line up with that around, again, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But it need not be work in the traditional sense, I think.
For sure. Joseph, thank you so much for your time. I don't want to abuse it. It's been 50 minutes already. Can you imagine?
Time flies when you're having fun. I don't know. Have we solved all the problems of AI and the future of work yet?
The world. Thank you so much. If people would like to follow you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, you can find my website at josephsmarr.com, and I'm J Smarr on most social media, so X or anything else, LinkedIn, whatever. And so feel free to reach out and be happy to talk to anybody who wants to go deeper on any of these topics.
Fantastic, Joseph. God bless you. Thank you so much for your time, and have a beautiful rest of the week.
All right, thank you too. Great to chat.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Leaders in Tech podcast. Check in next week to keep learning how to use technology and leadership to change the game. See you next time.